First of all, I'm going to tell you about the history of the history. In 1998, Christine and I were clearing out the old safe at Jireh Chapel, and we came across the original church book and documents relating to the building of the chapel, and that is what started us off on this trail. Jireh Chapel is in Pemberton on Chapel Street. The Fishergate pub is on the corner, if you know the area. It's a white building set back a bit. The word Jireh comes from Genesis chapter 22, when God tested Abraham's faith and asked him to sacrifice Isaac. At the last moment, God provided a sacrifice, a ram caught in a thicket. And the Hebrew Jireh, Jehovah Jireh, means God provides. And so the name of the church means God's the provider. After our efforts at finding the things in the church safe, we wrote an article for Past Forward, spring 1999, describing about how quickly the chapel was built. After that, the next sort of landmark was 2001, which was the 150th anniversary of the founding of the church. And we had a special events. I did a talk on the history, and we had a display on boards which were kindly lent to us by the Wigan History Shop. And the display was in the history shop for a while in the April of 2001. And then we had them in the chapel, and we had school children coming in and doing worksheets and so on. The next time the talk needed to be ready for was 2012, when we had a Northern Churches History Day at the church. And this PowerPoint was put together by Andrew, who is a member of our church. The last deadline was 2018, which I will explain later at the end of the talk. That deadline resulted in the publishing of this book, kept, and there were 100 copies of this printed. Right, so I'll now do screen share and go to the PowerPoint. 1851, I'll put it into historical context. It was the year of the Great Exhibition. It was also the year that the famous preacher Spurgeon began his first pastorate, aged only 17. It was the year the sewing machine was invented, and it was the year that Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick. The origins of the church started just before then, in 1848. A group of people left the Church of England and at first met in a house. A year later, they rented a room above a stable, which was behind where the school uniform shop in Pemberton is now. Numbers grew, and the 1851 religious census recorded Ebenezer Schoolroom, Pemberton, Particular Baptist, total seats, meaning how many seats to sit on, 120, morning attendance 40, afternoon attendance 60, and evening attendance 30. This was quite a large growth in only 3 years. Visiting preachers from various towns came to preach at the room. That was the 1851 also, 5 people gave their testimonies to Mr. Vaughan, a well-known preacher who often came to Wigan. He later became the minister of Shaw Street Chapel, Liverpool. The church book states that the 5 people stated something of what the Lord had done for their souls. They were baptized, but were not too sure where. It might have been in the brook in Brook Lane. And then they were formed into a church together on the 31st of March. They were baptized on the 31st of March and formed into a church on the 6th of April by Mr. Vaughan by taking communion together. These first 5 members were James Winnard, Samuel Grimshaw, George Clough, Henry Pennington, and Mary Pennington. The first recorded church minutes are in the original church book, which I'll show you at the end of the talk. This is a photograph taken in the 1960s of the original meeting place, which was in this top barn, hayloft. I don't think that's how you got in and out, actually. This lady actually who's standing there is one of the daughters of the second pastor. The Farriman family were very prominent in the life of the church for about 100 years. William Farriman was quite well off, and he seemed to own property and land. He died in 1831, so he was never a member of the church. His will in the County Record Office is in the County Record Office, Preston. The land he owned was in Goose Green, Kit Green, and Up Holland. When he died, he left £100 to each of his daughters, which was a considerable sum in 1831, £60 to his adult sons, plus the rents from his properties, and £100 each to Henry and George, who were minors at the time of their father's death. There were two Georges because the first one died in infancy. He left his wife his best bedsteads and hangings, 6 of his best chairs, and his best clothes chest. Henry was the first pastor at Jireh. Jane gave the land that the church is built on, and George was the first person baptized in the chapel. The 1841 census has them living at baiting houses in Kit Green. I'll just go back one. Let's come on a bit quick, that. Right. His widow, Ellen, is described as a farmer. 2 daughters are still at home, and Henry and George are still quite young. They also had 2 men servants. This is a map showing City Road with Kit Green and, at this end here, Latham Lane and the Miners' Arms, and baiting houses is here. Henry was born in 1825 and baptized in 1852, before the chapel was built. He's one of the earliest members, therefore. In the late 1850s, Henry and George bought or started a tannery in Tontine at Orrell, and they are listed in the 1858 Trade Directory as tanners and continued to be listed until 1876. On this map of 1893, the tannery is described as disused. The site is now the car park of the Delft Tavern. In Up Holland graveyard, we found an interesting stone. This is Thomas Bulmer, formerly of Great Ayton, Cleveland, died Up Holland Tan Yard, March 6, 1867, age 55. I haven't been able to find his post-mortem, which might have, or coroner's inquest, which might be interesting. In 1860, Henry was made a deacon, and his gifts in speaking became recognised. The church minutes record in 1870, the church warmly recommends and sanctions Henry Farriman's way and manner of speaking from the word of God, desiring that he would enter the pulpit. But in 1872, it was agreed by the church to ask Brother Henry Farriman to go into the pulpit and speak there instead of standing before the table, believing that his services are really acceptable. This is the only sort of mention of Henry being recognised as pastor. In 1874, he performed his first baptism. In 1878, he baptized his future wife, and his last baptism was in 1882. This is the marriage certificate of Henry and Elizabeth Williams. He was 20 years older than her, and he's described here as a farmer. Henry and Elizabeth had 3 children in quick succession, but as he died only about 4 or 5 years later, they never really knew their father. They were in effect brought up by his brother George, who lived with his sister-in-law Elizabeth and the children until his death in 1912. The only direct descendants are through his daughter Jane. George married the widow of a Mr. Millward, Mary Millward. She was Mary Anders before she got married, and the Anders family were very prominent in the church. Jane married James Dickinson, had 2 children, Elizabeth, who died fairly young of a weak heart, and David, and David's descendants now live in Kent. This is the tombstone in the Holland churchyard of James Dickinson and Jane, that's Henry's daughter and son-in-law, their daughter Elizabeth, who died at only 31, Ellen Farrimond, the eldest daughter, and Ellen Knowles, and I had no idea who she was or why she's buried with them. Another mystery. In 1883, he was the last person he baptized was Alfred Clough. He died in 1884. The last sermon he preached was in Southport. The Gospel Standard magazine has quite a touching obituary to him. Our friend Mr. Farrimond, Minister of the Gospel, Pemberton, took his departure on Monday the 10th of March 1884, aged 58, after suffering from cancer of the jawbone for about 12 months. During this time, the pain was intense, both day and night. For a long time past, he was not able to masticate any solid food, consequently had to support it chiefly by taking liquids. The Lord was pleased wonderfully to bless his labours, to the ingathering of many who came forward to testify what the Lord had done for their souls. The church at Pemberton has become one of the most flourishing in the north. He was a humble, plain man of very retiring habits, and his life was in accordance with his profession. He seldom left his people for more than one Lord's Day at a time. He was a sweet, experimental preacher, and his gifts having become a little known abroad, he was invited to London, but this he refused, preferring to remain at home with his own people. His heart was much with the people at Southport, and so desirous was he to serve them that he preached there his last sermon on the first Lord's Day in July last year, though at the time suffering much from the complaint, with his face bound up and his speech affected. His text at the time was Nahum chapter 1 verse 7. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and he knoweth them that trust him. Building the chapel. The need for the chapel was noted in the church book at the beginning of 1864. There was quite an increase in the congregation and of support. The collections nearly doubled to what they'd ever been before, and sometimes the room was described as too small, close, badly ventilated, under which there was a brew house and a stable, pigs, asses, horses, bad smells, noises, and besides, we were at the mercy of a publican at any 3 months. All these things combined to make us willing to build a new chapel. The publican could raise the rent every 3 months. This is shown in the church finance book. The first recorded amount is £3.18 and 9pence, April 1851, but by May 1864, the amount brought forward was £16 4 and 7. The room rental had been 13 shillings per quarter in 1851, but it had risen to £1 by 1864. The chapel is built on land which was part of the Duke of Bridgewater's estate and was rented out for 999 years. Originally, the chapel is, and the car park, had been subletted to Jane Farrimond, but she sold and transferred part of that land to the trustees of the chapel. The church minutes describe the circumstances surrounding the decision to build the chapel. James Howarth named a certain piece of ground as being very suitable for the site of the chapel. It had been on his mind for at least 2 years, and he said he would like Jane Farrimond to give us a portion of it, that we might have a house wherein we could worship God without fear of anyone turning us out or disturbing our meeting together. 3 weeks and 2 days later, Henry Farrimond and his brother George came specially to see James Howarth, and he says, this is Henry, "Well, James, with quite a pleasant smile on his face, and without a doubt on his heart also. We will give the ground for the chapel and for his school, also as much as is required, and £30 with it. The chapel went up in record time. On August the 12th, 1864, there was the first visit to the solicitors. On the 16th of August, the first load of sand arrived. This is the original receipt, one of the ones we found in the safe. 17th of August, the first load of lime. 22nd of August, the first load of stone from Old Haydell in Skemersdale. Matthew Barton and Sons, I got this receipt, lists various things needed, including 2 ornamental umbrella stands, 2 door scrapers, a set of fire irons, and a spittoon. There were modern fixtures and fittings in that gas lighting was installed by the Wigan Gas Company. Barlow supplied a chair and a table and other things. On the 1st of October, 100 invitation cards and 20 posters to advertise the chapel opening were printed. And the opening was on the 23rd of October 1864. 10 weeks and 2 days. It must be a record, that, somewhere. This is the oldest known photograph of the chapel, possibly during the First World War, because there are blinds on the windows and blackout was required in the First World War as well as the Second. This child seems to be wearing vaguely Edwardian dress. It's very difficult to tell. In 1867, the back hall was built. This was built as a schoolroom for children. Children's work was important from the beginning and continues to be today. This is a subscription list. On this, we have James Howarth, Henry Farrimond, George Farrimond, William Marsden, we'll come to him in a minute. And down at the bottom, a poor man, all he had, 1 shilling and a halfpenny. And Mr. George Glover gave 1,800 bricks. In 1912, there were proposals to make alterations, and Henry's wife Elizabeth said that as we have decided to keep the property adjoining the church in the family, I wish to tell the church I will give them sufficient land for an enlargement of the building. This produced a side entrance, which you can see here with this dog leg here. There's an entry there. But nothing else was done about altering the chapel. And of course, then there was this First World War. In 1926, some alterations finally got underway. This is how the church was originally. This is the front wall. This is the side entry. These are toilets. This was filled with benches. That was the present schoolroom and the vestry. In 1926, this area here was made into 2 stories. Pitch pine pews were put in, and this back hall was also used for Sunday school. Upstairs, the room was divided by folding screens, and a kitchen was put in, and a different toilet outside. Electric lighting was also installed, and a new pulpit. In 1963, this is the old pulpit, the new pulpit rather. In 1963, 2 back pews in the central row were removed, and a partition were put up to make cloakrooms. In 1966, Oral Urban District Council was doing slum clearance, and they proposed to demolish the chapel, but the piece of land that they wanted to give in as an alternative at the bottom of MacDonald Street was very small, and the church refused to sell. This is a 1964 map. As you can see, there's the church there. Of course, all this area here, these houses, all this area behind the chapel, all this was all demolished. but the chapel remained, which is why now there is nothing next to it. And this area now, which is Molyneux's Yard, is now Grosvenor Court, Old People's Flats. Well, the church outlived Orrell Urban District Council because it was absorbed into Wigan Metro in 1975. The next threat to the church was from mining subsidence. Under this corner, there is a bell pit, and there's another one at the other corner of the car park. I think this is why the land has never been developed. The end of the building began to sink, and we had a 5-year battle with the British Coal before they accepted liability and filled in the void and re-rendered that part of the building. The subsidence put a strain on the main chapel roof, which was not properly supported, and so it had to be repaired. The cost was considerable for a small church like ours, and loans had to be taken out. But through the Lord's goodness, these were paid off in record time. This is a view of inside the chapel roof. This is the rendering having been taken off, ready to put the new rendering on. You can see the original brickwork. In 2003, we were able to get a grant towards a toilet, a disabled toilet, and the old vestry was turned into a disabled toilet. We also carried out improvements by altering the lobby as you come in and by getting rid of the screens in the upstairs hall. The kitchen was refitted and new railings were put round, as we suffered quite a lot from vandalism and smashed windows at the time. Excuse me. The Marsden family. This family was prominent at the church for over 60 years. There were 3 generations called William, which is a bit confusing. This is the first William. His father was the landlord of the Rose and Crown in Orrell. He was baptized in 1860. He was a shoemaker. He married his second wife, Mary, in 1856. And they had 3 daughters. Jemima, she became the headmistress of Holgate School in Orrell. Miriam and Elizabeth were also school teachers at various times. They had a son, William, who died young. That is their other daughter, Elizabeth. Another daughter, Anne. And then their final son, William. You notice they're using the same name again. He became the pastor of Cherry Lane Strict Baptist Church in Lymm. 2 of his sons became ministers. We'll speak about this William in a moment. They had several children, as you can see. James, I'm just sorry, I've gone too far. James, here, was the pastor of Zion Church, Avenham, Preston, in 1963. John, this son, became the pastor at Hope Chapel, Rochdale in 1958. Both of these men, John and James, spoke frequently at Jireh and were trustees. If you note here, William was married to Ruth Warburton. If you remember that name, Warburton, that comes up in a moment too. World War I. I owe a debt of gratitude to Carol Littler, who does a lot of work on World War I records, for the information about some of these men. And it's also uncovered a forgotten hero. The William Marsden, who's just been on that family tree, the eldest boy, he won a DCM. He was in the 1st 10th Battalion King's Liverpool Regiment, the Liverpool Scottish. He was killed in 1917, aged only 19. His citation reads, for conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty when in charge of a Lewis gun. He pushed forward in the open and silenced an enemy machine gun, which was holding up his platoon. And afterwards, when a hostile bombing squad was working down the communication trench, he took his gun outside the parapet and by his fire prevented the enemy from passing a gap in the trench. He was the only man left in his team, but he kept his gun in action throughout. He doesn't seem to have a grave, but he's mentioned and remembered on the Cambrai Memorial in Louvreville, France. In 1915, the Christian's Pathway magazine, which was widely taken throughout the country, started a series of articles about men from strict Baptist churches who had volunteered for the services. If you see at the bottom here, Mr. B.A. Warburton, this is the brother and therefore of Ruth Warburton, who married the second William Marsden, therefore the uncle of the William Marsden we've just been talking about, if you follow me. The article for Jireh and Pemberton included several men with their pictures and what they were doing at the time. I've been able to find out some more information about these men, but not everything. And I've done an article about it, which is on the website that you can find the links to. Private Dickinson, was transferred to the kite balloon section, but died in 1919 after the war of an illness and was buried in France. I have no more information about Edward Dean. George Sherrington became an ambulance driver. Colin Turton survived the war and sometimes spoke at Jireh. J. Worthington survived the war and was demobbed and moved to Ashton in Makerfield. Percy Horton enlisted underage. He was wounded twice, gassed once. After the war, he joined the police. No more information about John Kenyon. And all I know about John Stanley is that he was wounded in 1916. As you know, conscription started in 1916, so obviously more men from the church went to fight, but it's not been possible to find out who they were. But one we do happen to know about is Ebenezer Anders. He was killed in 1917. Both his parents had been baptized by Henry Farrimond, and they had just moved to Bolton at the time of his death. The church minutes record the sending of a letter of condolence to Mr. and Mrs. Anders. Ebenezer was a railway worker at Upholland Station. He may not have had to enlist because I think railway workers didn't have to. He was unmarried. His grave is in the Messines Cemetery at Torrican Farm, number 1. It doesn't have a cross at his parents' request, but does have the Bible text. The Lord gave, the Lord hath taken away, from Job chapter 1, verse 21. I feel that he should have some sort of a memorial plaque at Holland Station, if anyone else agrees with me. World War II. We know of some men from Jireh who went to World War II. James and Tom Berry were brothers from a family which was associated with the church for many years. Both served in the Royal Engineers. Tom's daughters attended Jireh for a number of years, as did the daughters of their other brother, Ben, who was in the medical corps. John Barker served in the RAF in Canada, at Red Deer, north of Calgary in Alberta, on ground crew at a training facility for pilots. John was a deacon for many years at Jireh, as was his father before him. He died in 2005 and is greatly missed. He left some money to the church for a new set of hymn books. Now, sent out from Jireh. This is B.A. Warburton, who have just been mentioned before. Benjamin Warburton was always known as B.A. Warburton. He was baptized in 1901 and his sister Ruth, as we've seen, married the second William Marsden. He became the minister of Zion Chapel, Great Avenham Street, Preston, from 1923 to 38. Then he became the pastor of the Tabernacle in Brighton. He was editor of the Christian's Pathway magazine for quite a long time, from 1933, and he died in 1957. The other person set out was David Hyam, who is watching tonight. In 1986, David, who had been a deacon here, moved with his wife Laura to Bury for 5 years to work with Jeff King in the reviving of the work there. This was known as the Bury Project. The members from Jireh were very involved in the early years, and Radcliffe Road Baptist Church, Bury, is large and flourishing in a purpose-built building. In 1992, David moved to pastor Walkton Evangelical Church, where he remained until 1997, and then went to work for Grace Baptist Mission. There he served until 2008. David and Laura now live in Aigburth, Liverpool, and since 2009 have been involved in the Christian radio station Flame, which is based on the Wirral. David comes to preach at Jireh sometimes, and both David and Laura became Christians and were baptized at the church. There have only been 6 pastors in 167 years. After Henry Ferryman, there was a long break until 1933. This may partly have been due to the First World War. Thomas Clough had been baptized in 1916 by B.A. Warburton and served as a deacon. He preached at Jireh and other surrounding churches. In 1933, he was inducted as pastor, but sadly died suddenly 2 years later, aged only 55. He was a partner in the building firm of Clough and Gaskell, which was well known locally. He produced magazines for the church. The next minister was Mr. Mutimer in 1973, a very large gap. He worked full-time and lived in Accrington, so obviously this wasn't a very ideal arrangement. He left in 1975 due to ill health. The church recognised the importance of someone to lead the work full-time, and Trevor Baker was called in 1976. Under Trevor, several people were baptised and added to the church, and some of whom are still in membership today. Mr. Baker left in 1996 to work for the Albanian Evangelical Mission. We then entered a long period without a pastor and had a lot of expense regarding the building due to the roof problems that have already been mentioned. But God is good, the debt was paid off in record time and funds became available to support a pastor again, and so we were led to Alan White. We welcomed Alan and Georgie in 2004. They came from a church in South Wales. They were a great blessing to us. After 5 years, Alan retired, but stayed at the church for a while before they moved to Leeds to be near their family. Sadly, Georgie died in 2019. In 2012, Matthew Gray became our 6th pastor. This is the picture from 2012. The children are considerably larger now. Children's work. It was always the intention to give children's work, as shown by the building of the schoolroom in 1867. This is a receipt showing a list of items for the Sunday school. It includes 3 dozen reading books, 12 Bibles, 12 Testaments, 50 hymn books, school books, and a bell at 1 shilling and 7pence halfpenny. The first Sunday school would have taught reading and writing as well as Bible knowledge. This was usual for the time when education was difficult to obtain for the working classes. A library was introduced in 1874, a useful source of books for those who couldn't afford to buy them. Library books had rules for borrowing them inside, and there was a fine of 2pence per week for keeping a book over the fortnightly lending period. The Sunday school was organised as a separate entity with its own superintendent, committee and finances. This was usual at the time. In 1935, there were about 100 on roll. Annual outings were introduced before 1923, I don't know when, Rivington Pike being the popular venue before World War II. Sunday school anniversaries were only introduced in 1923. The Sunday school had an annual tea meeting and in 1912 bought a set of crockery. The tea meetings were suspended in 1939 because of the war and never resumed. An annual Christmas party was introduced instead. The Sunday school as a separate entity closed in the 1980s, but children's work continued. One person who served the Sunday school faithfully for many years was Mrs. Margaret Leach, one of the daughters of Thomas Clough, who was baptized in 1935. This is a Sunday school outing, we think, in the 1960s at Astley Park in Chorley. There are various Sunday school receipts from the 1960s to the 1980s, including the cost of tuning the piano, Sunday school prize books, and the hire of a coach to and from Southport for £40. Toddler's Time was introduced by Trevor Baker's wife in 1979. This is a photograph of the 25th anniversary. We also had children's work on a Wednesday evening for infants and for juniors on a Friday night. We used to run a Covenanter group as well for teenagers. Another teens work started in 2006, but this obviously has had to stop. We've been having holiday Bible clubs on the week after Easter since 1990. This includes Bible teaching, refreshments, games and crafts. It's always an enjoyable and exhausting week. There's Alan White there leading games in the back hall. In 2011, we were unable to have the Easter Holiday Bible Club on the usual week because of the way the school holidays fell. Therefore, in the May half term, we ran a week of events with the open air mission. This involved a certain amount of embarrassment for some church members. This is me, by the way, pretending to be Sarah, Abraham's wife. We dressed up as Bible characters while local school children came to view the display with their teachers, and we ran a Bible club in the evenings. The exhibition was excellent and can be highly recommended. This is the children looking at the Bible exhibition. For several years in the summer months from 2005, we ran a literature table near Pemberton Shops. You may have seen us. Also from 2009, we had weekends in Keswick at the Convention Centre for several years. In September 2010, this is a barbecue at Beacon Country Park. In 2010, Georgie White started the Ladies' Bible Study, which is still going on. We're on Zoom at the moment. We also began a knit and natter group in October 2011, knitting items for babies in Malawi. This is the church in 2012. A church isn't bricks and mortar, of course, it's the people, and its aim is to spread the good news about the Lord Jesus Christ to as many as possible. This was always the aim at Jireh, and we believe that being faithful to God is the reason why God has kept the church for 167 years and provided for its needs. So is that the end of the story? Well, yes and no. In February 2017, the elders and deacons of Pemberton Evangelical Church, Wardley Street, approached our leadership with a proposal that the two churches should merge. Pemberton Evangelical Church was formerly known as Rehoboth Calvinistic Chapel. After 9 months of meetings and deliberations, both churches formally agreed to a merger. The name of the new church is Pemberton Free Grace Church. The official launch was in September 2018, which is why my book had to be ready for the launch. So that is the end now. I'm going to, if you put me onto speaker view, I can show you the original church book and 1 or 2 other items. This is the original church book, so as you can see, is rather large. It's typical Victorian book. The pages are made of a sort of parchment. It's not paper. In here is all the early history of the church in very nice copperplate writing. It records the church minutes for quite a few years, but then eventually it just recorded the people who were going to become members. They kept a list in it of everybody who was baptized and joined the church. I can just show you that. It's a bit heavy to lift. You see there's a list. The names of the people and when they were baptized, and then quite often when they died as well. That's also recorded. And that goes from the first person, Samuel Grimshaw, right up to John Barker, who, if you remember, was in the RAF in Canada and was a deacon at the church. Since then, they've been recorded in the ordinary church minutes. These are some of the original receipts from the building of the chapel. You see, they're not in very good condition. That's John Fairclough, timber merchant, Walgate, steam mills. This is Old Hay Delft up Holland for stone. There seem to have been quite a few quarries in that area towards Skelmersdale. This is Matthew Barton receipt and gave us where they bought the spittoon. This is one of the plates from the 1912 crockery. And this is the Christian's Pathway magazine. It came out monthly, but then it was bound into a volume at the end of the year. And here we have an editorial by B.A. Warburton and his signature at the bottom. I obviously have other things as well, but I thought that would be sufficient for today. So thank you very much.